recording now? Yes, it started. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you all this morning and to share with you some experience I have applying sensory in the food industry. So I designed the lecture actually with a lot of examples. For each example, I will try to explain what are the specific constraints that we have, why did we choose this method or another one, so that you see the reflection which is behind and how you can adapt the different sensory analysis methods to some industrial context. So specifically here this morning, I would accept questions after each example, because I want to make sure that everything I share with you is very clear. And there are a lot of examples. Maybe it will be more difficult at the end to come back to one specifically. So I will always ask, okay, is there any question? And then you have the opportunity to ask some. So let's start. So my lecture is called Specificities and Constraints in Using Sensory in the Industry. And I will focus on what I know, meaning food. So I will not be able to share other examples, but I try to share as diverse as possible on different types of food products. And most of the examples I took are from the bakery, patisserie, and chocolate field, which is the field that I'm working in today. So during this lecture, I will try to point out some specificities and constraints that you can have in using sensory in the industry. That may be very different from challenges you have in other circumstances and other contexts. So one specific element is actually indeed the environment you are working in when you are applying sensory in the industry. So industry is usually a context where you need to go fast. So you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of research and about different methodology. And sometimes you have pressure that are linked to the, let's say, the flow of the project, and you need to deliver at some specific time. So choosing the right sensory methods is always a balance between be able to go as fast as possible, but still delivering reliable results, because sensory is a science, so we want to apply it in a good way. But you will have to sometimes find adaptation on the methodology to be able to deal with the time constraints. Another element that is impacting a lot the way to choose your methodology and to apply them is the type of population you are dealing with. And in my case, I'm working in an international company. So I'm confronted to an environment where I have all type of culture, all type of nationalities, all type of languages. And that can be a big challenges in applying, for instance, descriptive analysis, because we need to align on some language. That's also very specific setting for consumer studies, because if you work in an international company, where would you organize your consumer test? Well, obviously, depending on where the target country for your product, but sometimes you want to develop a product for a big region. So there are some reasoning there and a lot of thoughts about which consumer are we going to target. And another element that you can consider, which is maybe not so obvious, and that's also a specific situation, is if you work in a company that sells directly to consumers, it's not at all the same context as if you work in a B2B company. which is my case. I'm working at Puratos. It's a company that produces ingredients. So the ingredients are not sold directly to the consumers. We sell the ingredients to our customers that are bakers, pâtissiers, chocolatiers from the industry, retail, or artisans. And here we are not considering the sensory sometimes in the same way, because we do not only need to please the consumer, we need to please the customer first. Also, if you work on ingredients, you have to apply your ingredients in some product. So there is always some challenge here as well, sometimes to find the right recipe or the right product to use the ingredient in. So that's about the overall context. Then you have to consider some challenges linked to the product. In the industry, you can have companies that are targeting one specific category of product. So for instance, you have companies that sell only chocolate, company that sell only beer, or that sell only coffee. But in the food industry, you have also a lot of companies that sell a big diversity of products, which means more challenges for the sensory, because we need to be as performant on the different product category. And it's the case in my current industry where we produce ingredients, but for different type of product and application. So it brings an extra challenge. How are we going to develop the sensory for all these type of products together? And it's linked with the second point I mentioned here about using ingredients. So when you use an ingredient, you will apply it in a product. The product can be more or less complex. I think there is a microphone which is open, as I have a background noise, and please switch it off. So I was saying, if you want to do your sensory on a product, let's say bread or a cake, this product can be more or less complex. So it can be just a simple bread, white or whole meal, or it can be just a simple cake like plain cake or chocolate cake. But you can think about more elaborated finished goods, like a nice fancy cake with different layers and a bit of cream on the top. That's something much more complex to consider with sensory. How are we going to describe the sensation coming from this product, which are very different depending on the bite you are taking? Or how will the consumer perceive such product when it's multi-layer or multi-component? It's the same with some bakery goods, with some let's say chunks or addition of grains in it that can give a very high complexity in the sensory profile. So that's another challenge that can be there. And then I mentioned as well something that is not usually very straightforward for people when they think about sensory. They usually think about simple product. But in the world of fermentation, which is the case at Puratos, where we produce some sourdough, we ferment cocoa, you can have some variability in this type of product. So there is a high variation between the production, because this is a living product, and it gives an extra layer of complexity. How will you organize a repeatable sensory evaluation considering this natural variability in the product? So that's one of the challenges we have, and I will give you an example specifically on this. Another element, as you know, in sensory, there are two most important elements, the products and the people. Another element that you have to consider when you work in industry is which judge am I going to use. So when you want to do some descriptive analysis, for instance, you have different situations, and some company will make the choice to have an internal panel of employees, and other company will make the choice to externalize the panel. Both are relevant choices. It depends, of course, on the context, on the resources, on the use you have of the panel. But that's very important to consider. Who will be the assessors, and how can I best use these resources to answer the needs? So at Paratos, for example, we have an internal panel. So we don't use external people to do the descriptive analysis. We only use the external people for consumer tests. A challenge I already mentioned is about the sensory vocabulary. So the bigger the company, the more difficult it is to apply a standardized vocabulary, especially if you are in an international setting and if you have a high diversity of product, which is the case I am in. So that can be a big constraint to align the people on the way to talk, and especially what concerns flavors. So I will give you also some examples linked to that. And then the last point, which is something that really needs to be thought through, is the maintenance of the panel and also the training. As I told you, in the industry, you are usually under high time and resource constraints. However, you want to make sure that your method is good and that your tool is efficient. So you need to find the right balance between spending time on training and maintaining your panel and using it for the business. So it's all a matter of balance and applying this to your context as well. So we have to design a program of training, program of maintenance that is realistic for the situation we are in. And the last element is about the methods. So today I will show you a lot of things that are not in the classical methods, that are much closer to the rapid methods that that you were introduced in a previous session. And I will make some reference to what you have seen in previous lectures. Also, why? Again, it's about the context, the need to go fast and precise, and also in the context where you have a high variability in the products. It's very much time consuming to apply all the classical method on all your product category. So again, it's a matter of balance. How will you balance the use of the classical method with the use of the more rapid method? And sometimes it means you need to adapt one or the other to your own context. So that's overall the different elements that I will be referring to when giving you the different examples. So let's go to the examples. I will start with one link to the sourdough. So I told you one of the challenges you can have in food evaluation with sensory is products that are evolving, like products from fermentation, and sourdough is a very good example. So I will show you an example of how we set up a quality control procedure for this type of product. I was not sure everyone is familiar with sourdough. So here I give you a definition. So sourdough is made, it's actually a mix of different yeast and bacteria that are growing on flour and that are naturally occurring in the dough. So actually in traditional recipes, you find only 3 ingredients. So you have a starter that consists a mix of flour and water where the bacteria and the yeast will grow. And then you add some salt and some flour. And you refresh it several times. And you use a part of it to make your bread. So usually we don't add anything extra. The sourdough will give a specific flavor profile to the bread. And at Paratos, we produce a lot of different types of sourdoughs. The problem about the challenge, let's say, is that in the production, as it's a living organism, you can control a lot of things, but still you will always have some deviation of the quantity of bacteria or yeast that they are growing. So the flavor profile will have a natural variability. Now, it's still very important to make sure that this variability is not too extreme, because we want to ensure to our customer that we will give one type of flavor profile. So we want to make sure there is a certain stability anyway. Hence, the interest to put in place a sensory quality control procedure. So the objective is to avoid any production problem or complaint from the customer. So to make sure that each batch matches a certain flavor profile, so it's consistent and it's conform, even considering this natural variability that is normal, that occurs in this type of production. As well, it allows to standardize the quality of the product, not only in the time in the same production, but also across production sites. So your sourdough can be produced in different countries. A lot of things can affect the flavor profile. It's not only it's not only the equipment, it can also be even the water that is used for the production. So by using the sensory QC procedure, you ensure that you have the targeted profile at the end of the production. That's very fundamental to ensure conformity and quality. So how did we develop the procedure? We wanted it to be very simple, because in each production site, we don't have a lot of people doing the quality control. So it's not a context where you have 20 people that can do a triangular test. It's not possible to implement this after each production. So we need to have a fast check of the sensory profile by the responsible of the production, so the operator which is there on site this day and is responsible for checking all quality control parameters. What we decided to do is to have a very simple procedure of comparison between the new batch and a standard. So I will explain you how the standard is selected. And we check the conformity to the expected profile for each type of sourdough. And we also check the absence of flavors that can develop during the production process. The expected profile, so meaning the sensory profile of flavors that this sourdough must have, is defined by the R&D department. And then it's up to the quality department to check that this flavor profile is matched at each production. So very concretely, I will explain you how we do. So I told you we have a gold standard. So we have, this is actually an old batch, a success production batch that was produced at one point in time. So when we have a very good batch, we can select it as our gold standard, and then we freeze it. Because if you let it in the fridge, I told you, bacteria and yeast, okay, even if it's a fridge, they can continue to grow a bit and the profile can still evolve. So the best is to freeze the golden standard in small aliquots and to take one out each time you need to do a comparison with a new batch. Then the operator will have to smell, so the golden standard, and the new batch and compare the profile. We do not have time each time to bake a bread with this sourdough for the operator to check. It's much too long. So the standard procedure is to smell and have a smell check. And if there is any doubt on the quality, then a bread can be baked, of course, to detect if some specific deviation will be perceived in the final product. So when we add sourdough to a bread, standard dosages is a few percent. So it's not as strong as what you will smell out of the production line. But if when you smell, you perceive, you're not sure, there is a kind of deviation, okay, better bake it in the bread and confirm that it will be as well perceived in the final product or not. So I told you in reality, there is not a lot of people that are doing that on site. So obviously, you need to have at least one, and this person must be trained. But ideally, if there are two people, it's better because one person can be sick one day, or yeah. So you can always have something that can come up that will, let's say, make your process a bit less efficient. So it's good to have a backup. And when I say the person has to be trained, yeah, obviously, because otherwise, how can the person say that this is conform or that there is any off flavor? So the person must master the basic flavor notes of the product and also be able to recognize some specific off flavor that are present. So here in the to implement this procedure, we started in Belgium, where our biggest production site is located. And the training involves all the quality control departments. Depending on the person who will be on site this day, everyone needs to be trained and needs to be able to recognize profile, identify the off flavor. But there are so many sourdough that are produced that to implement the procedure, you need always to start somewhere. And we decided to start for the products that have the highest risk, meaning the one that we know is much less stable. So the sourdough that are produced that are always very consistent in the profile, there is less risk of a deviation in the quality. But the one that we know that are a bit less stable, those are the ones we started with. And here you see that on the 15 sourdough that are produced in Belgium, we decide to focus only on part of them. Now it's all about training the people, because now if your people are not well trained, the task can be very simple. If they are not trained, they will not be able to complete the task. So we spend quite some time on training the people to recognize different profiles of the sourdough and to be able to detect the off flavors. A very important point here, and that could be a challenge, is to explain to the people the type of off flavor they can be confronted to. Because if the production is always very good, there is never an off flavor. So what is important here is to collect batches of production that were rejected, for instance. So when you have a defect in the production, you keep an aliquot of that because it will illustrate later on in the training a specific off flavor that can occur. We know, based on our knowledge of the sourdough, that some are coming more regularly than others, but it's a flexible procedure because there can always be a new off flavor occurring in any production because it's a live organism. So you are never sure 100% that you cover everything. So that's why it's important to always collect when there is a reject batch and check which type of off flavor it is and make sure it's in your library for the future to train your people. Here I put the details a bit on the training, just for you to realize how we can build up a small training session with people in this type of circumstances. You see, we divided in different type of exercise, and there are examples of what we did in group with the different people from the quality control department. So first, we want them to integrate in their brain what's the expected profile. But the expected profile, I told you, it's still a bit variable. So from one production to another, it will not be exactly the same intensity, or there might be a bit of deviation. So people need to know that this is still good. They need to know that's okay, even if there is some deviation. So they are able to remember what is a good batch. And then they must be able to identify when the deviation is too big. So for instance, if the intensity of the profile becomes too low, then the batch will be rejected. But we need to teach them that, because the people won't know directly. Also, if there is some specific off-flavor or defects that are coming in the profile, then the batch will also be rejected. So in the training, you need to let them smell batches that are rejected, that contain off-flavor as well, so that the people can familiarize with this. And then as a third step, we also teach them the procedure. So we explain what they will have to do, that they have to smell the gold batch and compare it to the new batch, and then decide on the conformity. Is this okay or not? And if it's not okay, what's the reason of rejection? Is it because the profile, it's not at all what we expect? So that's not the same product, so then there is a problem. Is it the same profile, but there is a kind of off-flavor in it, which is usually what happens? Or is it the same profile, but we have a problem in the intensity? That can also be there. And what's important, that the QC operator is able to tell exactly what's the reason. And obviously, if there is a rejection, then there will always be discussion afterwards with R&D. Yeah? So it's not only the person will point out the problem, but then there will always be an investigation on what's going on and how can we solve this issue. How can we understand where it comes from and solve it for the future production? So I've come to the end of the first example. If there is any question now on this example, do not hesitate to ask. No questions? Yes.
There's a question already, Abi.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you use a triangle? Are you hearing me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Can you use the triangle test method in the place of paired comparison, as a triangle method is more powerful? Actually, there is also DO3 tests like this discrimination testing method. Rather than using this paired comparison to make strengths, is it possible to use a triangle test method in place of paired comparison? Thank you very much.
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. So at this stage, we don't do it, because I told you this is a very quick check, and the operator is going to the freezer, taking out the gold standard, so he knows which one is the gold standard and which one is the new batch. So there is no way to make it blind here. What we do though is that if the operator has a doubt, so after having done this quick check, if the operator has a doubt, then he contacts the R&D and he says, okay, I have a problem with this batch, because usually it's not so clear, the defect, it can be very mild. So, and then there is a discussion, and that's the moment where triangle test can be organized, but then we would apply the product in the bread. So we will bake some bread with the golden batch and the new batch. And we will check on a bigger panel if the panel would perceive a difference. And in this case, we would apply indeed the triangle test. So that's a bit how we would do. Because organizing the triangle test at this stage is not possible. It's only 1 or 2 people who are checking. So it's very the first screening. And in case there is a light that is a red light given by the operator, then we go to a next stage where triangle tests can be organized, but in this case, in the final product. I hope it clarifies. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
Cecile, there was a couple of more questions in the chat that maybe people can make orally.
I see one from Martina. Maybe you can go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so well, I was just wondering about this golden standard. Who and how do you define it? And then I think now you just said that you freeze it so it keeps fresh, but can you be sure that it keeps the same taste properties over time?
Thank you for your question. Indeed, that's the biggest challenge we have in QC for this type of product. And we have the same challenge in chocolate.
Yes, I used to work
yes.
chocolate.
Because one production is never exactly the same as another. So here it's a let's say a conjoint decision between R&D, QC, production people on selecting a very good batch. That is really representative of a standard production. When it's selected, they put it in the freezer, but it doesn't say here forever. So say maximum 9 months, because afterwards we know that the freezing process can have an impact as well. So then after 6 months, for instance, people are already looking at a new one. So the golden batch is always renewed after a few months. So it's always one representative of a good production that is taken as the new golden batch.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Interesting questions, Cecile. I see one from Incan here. It says,
yes.
People trained for QC, what other roles do they have? I think it's an interesting one because that can have implications.
Yes, so probably it will depend from companies, but here the people that are here trained to apply this QC procedure are really only the people that are doing the quality control on the production. So they don't have other roles than, so they do usually some quality control measurement with instruments, and on top of all the checks, so for instance, sourdough, they check the pH, the acidity, and so on, and on top of that, they will smell. However, in the training, we train more people. So we not only train the QC, we also trained if possible, people working in production, people working in R&D, that everyone knows the procedure, everyone knows very well the default and so on. So it's a bigger pool of people who knows about this process, but the people that are responsible for really the task of checking the flavor profile is really the quality control operators.
That's good. Any more questions?
Okay, so we can go to the next example. So we'll change completely context. So here I will give you an example of use of sensory in product development. I have several of them, but the first one I select is on cocoa cakes. So I hope it makes you a bit hungry. I told you already that for cocoa, we have a very similar issue as for sourdough, because cocoa is a product that is extremely rich in flavors. So there is a lot of flavor molecules in cocoa. And also these flavors are developed at different stage during the process of elaboration of chocolate. So during the fermentation of cocoa, the drying of the beans, and then during the roasting process, a lot of flavor molecules will be developed. And then when you apply it, some cocoa in a cake, you will have a mix between this the flavor molecules coming from the cocoa that are very typical, and the flavor profile coming from the cake. So it makes it a very complex type of sensory evaluation. So here I wanted to share with you a challenge that we had in selecting some cocoa powders to use in our products. So in cake matrix. Why? Because at the time our sensory panel was not trained to describe the flavor profile of this type of product. So we had a lot of different type of cocoa powders. So here 13 variants that could be used in our cakes. But we didn't know exactly what it will give when it's applied in the cake matrix. So it's completely different when you smell or taste the cocoa powder, and afterwards when you smell or taste the cocoa cake. It doesn't give exactly the same profile. So because our panel was not trained, we could not apply the standard descriptive analysis. So we were thinking still, how can we try to sort out these different cocoa powders based on the flavor profile they would give in a cake? So which one would give a similar profile and which one would give a very different profile? And could we still try to generate some vocabulary and some words on how to describe these profiles? So because of the absence of training, and we didn't have time actually to train the panel, that would have been the most efficient, and would be in this case to really train your panel to develop a vocabulary and then to let them evaluate. But it was not possible for this project. So because of that, we decided to use a rapid method, which is called free sorting. So I don't know if, I'm not sure if you saw this, so I will just explain a bit what the method is about. So the sensory free sorting is you give to the people a set of products, and the people will have to group them according to their similarities and differences. So in the free sorting, the people are free to make how many groups they want. And so some people will make 5 groups, 6 groups, 7 groups, whatever. But each product can be only in one group. And at the end, when each participant has grouped the product into families, then we ask the participant to try to describe and to label each of the group. So to give you an example here, I put 2 cakes in one group and 3 in another, and I would say that the group of 2 is more intense in cocoa, for instance, or is more sweet. So that's an example. Here we had then our 13 cocoa cake, so same recipe of cake, but each time we use a different cocoa powder in the recipe. Okay, so it gives different type of flavor in the cake. And we used 31 judges, but we didn't use judges with no experience, because we thought it would be much too difficult for a judge that is not used to speak with sensory words to really describe the difference that were quite subtle. Here we wanted really to focus on the flavor. So we used judges that were already trained on a patisserie product. So meaning that this judge, they already have a bit of vocabulary, not specifically on cocoa, but overall on describing a cake, they would be a bit more comfortable. So when you do this exercise, so each of the 31 judges is making these groups, and then you can gather this data in a matrix. In this matrix, you will see how many times two products were grouped together or not. And it shows you the proximity between the different products. Based on that, with some statistical analysis, you can get an overview in a map of the proximities between the different products. Here I show you the result. So we have a kind of sensory mapping with the different cocoa powders in the cakes. So all the names that you see here are code names for the different cocoa powder that were explored. And sometimes you see into brackets the country where the cocoa powder came from. You also see all the descriptors. So these are the words that were used spontaneously by the people to describe the groups. So they are not standardized vocabulary. We just afterwards, we just check how many people use chocolate or burnt or strong, nutty or whatever. And then we can calculate the correlation on the map. So you see that the vocabulary is a mix of descriptive, but also indication of intensity, for instance, or sometimes a mix like light cocoa. That's normal with this type of exercise. Sometimes you even have some hedonic words as well. And so this is not obviously as precise as a standard sensory profiling. It just gives an indication of the differences. For this project, it was enough for us. We didn't need to have a very precise description. What we wanted is to see the groups, so to see which cocoa powder will give similar profile. And secondly, we wanted a bit to have an idea of the type of profile. So that was sufficient precision for this project. What you can see on the map I highlighted here in different zones with the circles is that you really have very different type of flavor that are occurring in the cake depending on the type of cocoa powder you put in. So on the right hand side, you see that we have 3 cocoa powder that are very described with more cocoa type of vocabulary, bitterness, smoky, burnt. So this is very strong type of flavor that would stay a lot in the mouth. While on the top of the chart, you see here some powders that will be very light in taste. So because the people mostly felt the creamy, sweet flavor of the cake. So meaning that they didn't really perceive a lot the flavor of the cocoa. And then on the bottom left, we have as well 2 powders that of a lighter profile. So it's cocoa nutty. It's not as strong as the one that you see on the right of the chart. So this example, I mean, the details are not very important here. My point is that even if your panel is not trained on one specific type of vocabulary, and when you don't have time to develop the training for them on the descriptive method, this type of methodology can be very helpful. Also, when you have a lot of samples, because here 13 cakes, that's a lot. So 13 cakes, if you would have 10 or 15 descriptors to evaluate, it would be a very hard task. Here with the sorting, you can really make groups and see the main differences between the products, and you can have a preliminary type of vocabulary that will give you trends and that either it's sufficient and you stop there, which was the case for us, or it's just a preliminary exploration of the product set. And afterwards, you can use these results to go a step further and to develop more descriptive vocabulary and evaluation. That's it for this example. Is there any question on this one? I'm just checking in the chat, but I don't see any. So I guess.
Cecil,
Yep.
can I ask?
Sure.
This is more of statistics, perhaps, but I see in your map the configuration, the critical stress. Is it a measure of agreement amongst the panelists, or what is it a measure of?
No, it's so the technique used, the statistical technique used here is the multidimensional scaling.
Okay.
And the stress is a measure of consistency between your map and your matrix. So you start with the matrix of proximity between the products. So if two products have been put together in the same group a lot of time, and they have a higher number, and if they have been always put apart, they have a lower number. So it's like a matrix of distance or proximity. And then the multidimensional scaling will propose you a graphical representation, and the stress tells you if this representation is reliable enough, and if it shows well your matrix or not. So the lower it is, the better is the representation.
Yeah, I think it's clear now, because since it's low, we can see that the groups are actually distinct, and it makes a lot of sense if I get you well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm not sure if participants want us to proceed, or we need a short break, or what do you think? Can we proceed?
For me, it's okay if they are. It's okay for everyone.
We seem to not to have a response. Let's proceed.
Okay.
There is a hand raised, James. Fatima.
Yeah. Fatima.
Yeah. Good morning, Mr. James and the presenter. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for this presentation. Actually, I'm just hearing for the first time this method of free sorting, and it actually seems okay. But my question is, you have already mentioned that is to give an idea of the flavor terms, terminologies that will be associated with the flavor. So it is not actually too accurate method like that, but just to give ideas, you said. But if the samples are so much, like the 13 samples you use in the cake, wouldn't it be confusing to some judges, considering that they are not trained? Can it be used for so many samples at all times like that?
Yes. So it all depends on the diversity in your samples. So indeed, if you give them samples that are very, very close to each other, the task might be too difficult. And it depends as well on the experience of the people, as you say. So here in this case, the people were not consumers, and they were already familiar with the sensory, and they were already trained on vocabulary a bit to describe patisserie. So it's not like a naive people. However, I know the free sorting, you can use it with consumers as well, but you have to be sure that what you present them as samples are not too close. And we have some experience in doing that with chocolate. With consumers, they could handle 12 chocolates, different ones, and they could do the exercise without any problem. However, the chocolate we presented them were quite different. So they had it was dark chocolate, and they had very different percentage in cocoa. So if you would give only 12 chocolate, all 70% cocoa mass, then that might be very difficult. But if your product space is diverse, then this task is goes well even with 12 to 15 samples, even with untrained people. Thank you for your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I will move on with the next example, and this one is on bread. So I really try to to give a diversity of example. We are still in the product development context, but here it's very different type of objective. So the goal of this study was to try to have a kind of mapping of the preference for toast bread in Europe. We know in toast bread, so that's the bread that is packed, white bread packed for toasting. We know that in terms of texture, this type of product is very different from one country to another in Europe. And we wanted with this study to have a clear picture of those differences and what type of texture would consumer prefer in one or the other country. So the core of it is consumer tests, but we also had to apply descriptive analysis to be able to understand better the preferences. So this is what I just explained. So here the goal is really to have to understand better the consumer texture preference, and also to check if some consumers in one country would appreciate texture from another country, because then it would show some business opportunity for specific textures. So how did we build up this study? So first we said, okay, we need to do some consumer tests. And we need to do these consumer tests across Europe, because we want to compare how people like the textures in France and how they like the texture in Spain, for instance. However, it's not enough, because then we will need to explain why people like this product or this one. So it would be interesting to also have a sensory description of the different toast bread. Then, if we have both, we can try to make the link and identify which specific texture characteristic are driving the liking. And to do that, you need to relate the preference with the sensory characteristic. It's what we call a preference mapping study. But first, the challenge, and that's a very typical challenge in, that's a very typical challenge when you work with market samples, is that you have a lot of market samples. And if your scope is Europe, you will have different brands of toast bread in each country. So even when we pre-selected the most famous brands of all the countries, we already had more than 20 products in total, because our scope was all Europe. So it was much too much for a sensory study. Imagine you go to the consumer and you ask them to test 20 toast breads. That's not feasible. So how do you do in this case? Well, you have different possibilities. One possibility could be to do the free sorting I told to you about in the previous example. Why not? In this case, we also have the opportunity to use some instruments that are able to measure the texture. the instruments are never as efficient as a human, because it's just a probe that press on the bread, and I will measure some different criteria like the hardness or the resilience of the product. So it's not complete, but it already gives an idea, and it allows to screen a bit the different products. And we completed that indeed with some preliminary screening in the project team. So all the texture specialists also evaluated the different breads and sort them out. So it was not an official free sorting study, but more a quick one. So finally, we came up with the selection of 8 breads that were different enough in terms of texture, but considering as well that we wanted to have representatives from all the country. We didn't want to have no bread from France and 3 bread from Spain. So we took that as well into account, making sure that each country was served. In some countries we had 2, and in other we had only 1. Another challenge when you want to work with market sample, fresh market sample, is the shelf life. What is a fair comparison? And we had a lot of thoughts about this. Is a fair comparison to evaluate all products at the same date? So for instance, a bread is produced, it's put in a pack, and you would evaluate all the breads after 5 days. Or is a fair comparison to consider the overall shelf life of each of them and cut it in 2? Because you have to know that for toast bread, in some countries like Italy, the shelf life is 3 weeks. While in other countries like UK, the shelf life is 3 to 4 days. So it's not at all the same. Now, to make it to what we thought was the most fair comparison was to do all the breads at half their own shelf life. But it was not possible for UK, because UK, it's 4 days anyway. So the moment they send the product to us, the bread was already at the end of the shelf life. So that's an exception. But that's something that is very important to take into account when you work with fresh market sample. What would be the fairest comparison if the shelf life is not the same for all the samples? So we first complete the sensory mapping. So here, our objective was to highlight the main sensory difference between the 8 breads. We used the flash profile to do this. So I think you saw this methodology in a previous session. So the flash profile is about is really aiming at doing this specifically, so showing the main differences between the product. So with a flash profile, you will select some descriptors that represent the difference, and then rank all the products on each of those descriptors. And for this, we use 10 trained judges on bakery, so that already had some vocabulary to speak about texture of bread. And another challenge we had for this project is that the toast bread is not consumed the same in all of the European countries. There are some countries where you just consume it like this to make a sandwich. And there are countries where most of the consumer will toast it. So they put the bread in a toaster and they use it, and then they put some jam or butter or whatever. And obviously, whether you toast it or not, you don't get the same sensations. So we thought we would do both. So we made one sensory descriptive evaluation on the untoasted breads and one on the toasted breads. And I will show you that the results were actually quite different. Here I show you the sensory mapping that we got on the untoasted products. So just the product out of the pack. And you see the names of the breads are actually the names of the country. And when it says UK1, UK2, those are the 2 breads from UK. We also had 2 bread in France. And you see Germany, Sweden, and Italy on the chart as well. What you can also see is that we have 2 colors for the descriptors. So in blue are the descriptors of the texture. And in red, also the judge highlighted some flavor differences. However, you have to know that for this type of product, the flavor is very mild. So it was not strongly butter or strongly sweet. It's just a hint on the different on the flavor profile. And the alcohol perception for the breads of Italy and Sweden is linked to the preservative that they put in the pack, because I told you these breads, you can keep them from 3 weeks, meaning there is some preservative there. So it's not directly linked to the product. After 15 minutes out of the pack, the flavor is gone. What interests us most was to see if, in terms of texture, which bread were the more soft and moist, which bread were the more hard or the more resilient. So this is what you see here on the map. Now, when the breads are toasted, the story is a bit different. Especially, you see the proximities of the bread have changed. So just an example, the 2 breads from France, they were close already here. They are still close. They are even closer when you toast them. While the 2 breads of UK that were quite close, now they are a bit more apart. So meaning after toasting, these 2 breads evolve differently. But the most surprising thing was the bread from Spain that was out of the pack, closer to UK and France, and there it's completely opposite. So that's very interesting, and that's why it was worth doing the exercise. Also, that you say when the bread is toasted, then it's not exactly the same vocabulary that is used, because the bread becomes crispy, and we didn't have this crispiness on the standard soft bread out of the pack. Also, the flavor intensity is mentioned here because when you toast the bread, some flavor is more released in some of the products. So here as well, I didn't mention, but there was a challenge on how you will toast the bread. So will you toast the bread the same time for all of them? Or will you toast the bread up to the point that the bread becomes brown? So again, here we had to make a choice. It's all about choices in sensory at some point on the methodology. So we decided to toast them the same time, because it was a nightmare actually to try to toast them at some at a certain point, some for 2 minutes, some for 3, some for 4, practically too difficult. So we made some pre-test and we selected the time, I think it was 2.5 minutes, where all the breads were more or less brown, and that was our reference point. So that was for the descriptive part, but then I told you, of course, this is just to help us in the interpretation of the consumer test. So the core of this study was to run the consumer test on the 8 breads and the same set of 8 breads, so meaning same shelf life, in each of the countries that we had selected. So to remind you, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Sweden, so 6 countries. Now, we didn't do all the toasted and untoasted in all the country because of resources and time constraints, but we selected to do one or the other based on the consumption habits of the country. So if most of the consumers were eating untoasted bread, then we did the untoasted version. If most of the consumers were eating toasted bread, then we did the toasted version. So I will now show you some results. Obviously, there is a lot of results, so I had to select some of them that I found interesting for the interpretation of the sensory. I don't know if you have seen this type of chart already. So if not, no worries, I will explain. This is what we call a preference mapping chart. You will recognize that it's the map that I showed you earlier of the untoasted bread, okay, with Spain, UK, and France on the right, the other breads on the left. What do we do here is that we plot on top of this map a color map. And the color map represents the preference of the consumers. So this model is built from the consumer data. So we went to Spain and we had the Spanish consumer evaluate these 8 untoasted breads, and we asked the Spanish consumer to give a liking score to each one of them. When we have collected all this data, we built up this model relating this consumer data to the sensory mapping. And then the color codes indicate zones of preference and zones of disliking of on the map. So it shows you directly, visually, with colors, which product and which zone of sensory characteristic pleases the most people. So this, I told you, this chart is from Spain. So you see that the red zone is the zone that we want to target. So that's the zone where you have more preferences of the consumers. And in this zone, you have 2 products already. You have the one product from France and one product from UK. So it means that the product that will fall in this zone will be the one that have more chances to be liked by the Spanish consumer, while the product that will fall in the blue zone are the ones that have less chances. Now, what is interesting on this chart for us, what was interesting, is that you see the Spanish product is on the right, but it's more in the yellow zone. So actually, it means that the texture of the Spanish product is not bad. It pleases the consumer. It's okay, but the model predict that they would be more pleased with other type of texture, like the one of the UK product, for instance. So the consumer will appreciate a texture a bit different than what is actually now on the market, which, by the way, was the bestseller. And for us, that's extremely interesting because it shows some specific opportunity for the Spanish market, maybe to adapt the current texture of the toast bread. I selected another example of preference mapping for Germany. So for Germany, I think it's 95% of consumers who eat their bread toasted. So here we gave them the 8 bread toasted, and we compare it to we make the link with the descriptive evaluation of the toasted bread. So you see the map is the one of the toasted bread, and the same. So we look at the colors on the chart and we try to spot the zone of highest preference that shows us the type of product and the type of sensory characteristic that would drive the liking of consumers. You see this zone is now on the left. It's not so dark, so it's orange. So meaning that it's not, with this set of product, we haven't reached the ultimate toast bread, but still the consumer, they really go for the most crispy product. So the one that is most colored, that's more crispy. And this is the most toasted, let's say. And they don't go for bread that is still more soft and moist, even after toasting. So, and here, same conclusion as previously, we see that the Italian product is closer to the preference of the German consumers than the German product, because it was indeed described as more crispy, and this is really what the German consumers were looking for. So to conclude on this example, I've reached the end here. As you can see, preference mapping is a very powerful tool for sensory. So it's really about relating the consumer preference or liking on the one hand, and the descriptive evaluation of the product on the other hand, to be able to pinpoint which sensory characteristic are driving the most the liking of the consumers. In this study, I also wanted to show you the challenges we had in terms of methodology. Toasting the bread or not. I'll let you imagine how you have to organize yourself to toast 8 breads for more than 200 consumers. So that's quite some logistics. And also the challenge on the shelf life. And if you do this type of preference mapping, a key point is really to give exactly the same samples to the consumer and the expert. If I would have changed the shelf life and, for instance, tasted some bread beginning of shelf life with the expert and end of shelf life with the consumer, it's not the same product. So you really need to ensure that you are exactly in the same condition, product condition for both tests. I would take any question if there are now on this example.
Hi, Cecil.
Hello.
Hi, it's Nazuka speaking from South Africa.
Yes.
Just to refer back to the example that's in discussion at the moment. Firstly, you make mention of the fact that as an example, you use toasted bread, and you've selected 8 different brands of bread. So what I would like to know, in order to standardize the sampling of the different brands, were they already sliced? Number one, that's my first question, because obviously that would affect the outcome of your appearance, your taste and texture of each different bread of the toasted bread.
Yes, good question. So indeed, all these bread are already sliced because they are sold like this in the package. So the product for this study, one product is actually one bread, one brand, one shelf life, and one format. You cannot uniformize indeed the format of serving. So the color difference were not strong. They were very mild, but the size of the slice were different, and also the thickness of the slice were different. But that's what consumers are eating on the market. So we did not change anything there. We just kept the format as it was. But that's a very good remark. Your product unit is indeed, in this case, the product and the format and the shelf life.
So you didn't find some form of bias in the results outcome as a resultant of the slices not being of the same thickness, because obviously you standardized the toasting time as being 2 minutes 30 seconds. Now, what I'm trying to ascertain or understand is, in doing that, obviously, if you have a variability of the thickness of the slices, now, how did you try and manage that? Because obviously, the results outcome would differ for each brand, depending on the thickness of the slice.
Yes, indeed. And that was the case. So let me come back to here. That was the case because actually the bread from UK are thicker overall, and they are also a bit denser in the crumb. And this is why when you toast them, all the breads at the same time, this one are less, a bit less crispy because you have a bit more crumb in the middle that stays moist and soft. So that's the case in this study. Our objective was not to promote any brand or to validate any brand. Our objective was to create sensory differences and to challenge the consumers on that. So we didn't want then afterwards to go to the customer who is selling UK and tell him that his bread is not good or whatever. What we wanted is to have good products and to show a diversity of texture. So for us, it was not a problem to have some breads that were less toasted than that because they were thicker and still a bit moist and soft in the middle. It was okay because it shows we were not sure what the consumer would like. Okay, so in Germany, they didn't like it, but in other countries, it was not the same. So you have some consumers in other countries that liked it when it was a bit less toasted and still a bit soft and moist in the middle. So you see, it's indeed, we had to standardize something to be able to compare, but we know we are not representative of toasting in each country. Obviously not. If the goal would have been to be representative for each of those brands of the real toasting, then we would have had to adapt the toasting time for each thickness. But it was not the goal of this study. So we preferred to standardize for practical reason, and it was okay for us just to create sensory diversity. I hope it answers your question. I see that okay, thank you. I see that some people are asking for the data, which is good. I can provide I can provide the data so that you can train yourself to reproduce the analysis, no problem. Okay, so if there are no further questions, I would continue. Now it's a new example on donuts. So we'll speak a bit about flavor again, or a combination of texture and flavor, because in sensory in general, from the experience I have in industry, it can be different in other industries probably. We experience that in terms of sensory training, sensory knowledge and expertise, it's much more difficult to grow on the flavor aspect because of the diversity of flavor molecules and flavor types. While in terms of texture, you can more easily reach good reliability of your panel, even with a lower number of people. So I will talk to you about challenge in COVID time with this next example. So we are all confronted to this, and actually it makes even the current challenge is even bigger to complete the sensory evaluation. So that's also an important message, I think, to share with you this morning. We had to complete last year a benchmark of US market donuts on request of one of our customers that wanted to have a description of his product compared to the market. Unfortunately, we have no expert panel trained on descriptive analysis in the US. So the US requested the help of Paretos Belgium to complete this evaluation. Here I included a picture of the different donuts to show you also that they are not all the same shape. They do not all have a hole in the middle. So these are products that are sold on the US market. and they all have different type of crumb structure as well. So our challenge was to describe this different type of texture and also the flavor profile. I don't know if you have all already once tasted a donut, but that's not an easy product to handle with sensory because it's very greasy, very heavy. So when you have 6 donuts like this, to evaluate it can be a challenge. Here I share with you the standard vocabulary we use to evaluate this type of product in my company. So you see the different texture and mouthfeel descriptors that are standard to evaluate donuts. You see that for each descriptor we have a definition and we have a process to evaluate with some picture as an illustration. So some sensations are evaluated with the hands and some sensations are evaluated in the mouth. You see that in the different sensations, some are similar to what we saw in the previous example, because actually the donut is a soft product. So some sensations are similar to what you have as well in soft bread. However, in the donut, as I told you, it's very oily and greasy product. So this fatty perception is also very important. So it's also in the list here at the bottom. And what we did is that we used this vocabulary to compare the different products from the US that we received. However, we had a big challenge was the amount of available judges. You see only 5 people, and this is because of the COVID, so it was in the middle of the lockdown. So we had 2 choices. Either we do nothing and we let the US customer with his doubts, or we say, okay, we will try to do a small scale evaluation. The number of experts will be limited, but still it's some sensory information. And you see, we decided to do it anyway, because it's a big customer for us. And actually we had nothing to lose. We are more to gain by doing the evaluation and check afterwards if the people agree with each other. So obviously, if you have only 5 people, and if they all disagree, it will be difficult to make conclusions. So that was a bit a challenge, but we did it anyway. And then we checked in the results if it was consistent. Usually our standard is more to have 10 to 12 participants for this type of evaluation for texture. And for flavor, usually we go up to 15 because we know that for flavor there is more variability between the individuals. So here you will see a very limited outcome, only on 5 people, but that's the reality of the industry as well. For flavor, we have no standard vocabulary for flavor of this type of product. So we let the people free to describe. And then we looked at if there were some consistency in the way in the words that were used by our experts. I share here with you the mapping of the texture description. So you see the positioning of different donuts on the chart and the different texture descriptor that were used. You see that the fattiness, so the greasiness, as I told you, is a very important descriptor as well. And especially we had 2 donuts that were much more fatty than the others. Just by the way, the steam cake donuts is a quite different texture from the other types. So it's logic that that we see it a bit apart from the rest of the different donuts. So just here to highlight this. So even if we had only 5 people, this is the results of the evaluation with the 5 people, and it was very consistent. So there was no problem in the interpretation. So people could really highlight the main differences. When you see that the word is written bigger, it means that you had more consensus between the people on this specific sensation. So especially the moistness, the fattiness, the melting, where you had a strong agreement between the judges. You can also perform some statistics there. Okay, we had only 5 people, so it's a bit far-stretched. But it's just to show you what you can do in another case, maybe with more people. Even here, with only 5, we still had some significant results. So meaning that the differences between the donuts were very big in terms of perception. If the difference would have been more subtle, most probably we would not have had a significant result on the different criteria. So here you just have per descriptor, the comparison, well, the level of the different products, so the different ranking, and then you have highlighted in gray what is the statistical difference. So for softness, for instance, you have 2 products, so the Hostess and the Tasty, that are significantly less soft than the steam cake donuts. It's another way, another visual, so just also to share the same information in differently. You can also calculate the difference between scores or between ranks between the different products, and then it shows you with bar, the bar either blue or red. So when the bar is red, it means that this product is less of this descriptor compared to the average, while the bar is blue, the product is more of this descriptor compared to the average. So you really see that the steam cake donut is more of everything except maybe the resilience, but it's more of the soft, more of the moist, and so on. You also see on the first one, the cinnamon donut, Tasty. This one is much less of the softness, which is exactly what you saw on the previous graph. So it's just another way to illustrate the same information, just to inspire you. And then for the flavor, so I told you we only let the people free to describe the flavor. So there is no statistics here. It's just a number of citations of the different descriptors that we regrouped at the end. So it's only qualitative information here. You count how many judges on the 5 people used one or the other word, and we regroup them. However, you can see some interesting information, even if it's qualitative. So, for instance, in the dairy, so dairy, which is every type of flavor that is linked to milky or creamy, you see that you have one product that is much stronger on this type of flavor. So this is the steam cake. This is the blue bar. And some other flavor notes are also more typical of one or the other type of donut, like the sweetness. So the sweetness was mostly used for 2 of the donuts and not for the other. So meaning that it's the judge paid attention to sweetness only in 2 products. So be careful, it's only frequency of citation, so it's not about intensity. It's about the type of flavor that the judge could detect. Okay, so you cannot interpret it as really as an intensity. It's more a proportion of people who perceive this sensation. But we infer that if more people perceive the sensation, this sensation is characteristic of this product. But it doesn't mean that it's very intense. Okay, so that's the limit you have with this type of citation, like in a check all the supply analysis is this. However, it gives you information on the profile. So something interesting here, though, the other way, you can take it the other way around. It's not because only one person cited the descriptor that it's not important. In flavors, you have to be careful because we have all different sensitivities in the flavor. So even one person can be very sensitive to one specific characteristic. And this characteristic can be important for also other sensitive people. So you should always be careful not to discard any flavor that would be only spotted by one person. Here I didn't include in this presentation, but we regularly have problem of remarks from customers or complaints about off flavors in the product. And a big challenge is to detect it. So imagine a customer tells you, I have a problem with this donut. I perceive a rancid off flavor, and please do something about it. Your first challenge will be to find someone in the R&D or in your team who will be able to perceive the rancid. And it's not so easy because sometimes the off flavor might be obvious, but usually if it's obvious, you don't sell the product. So it's screened out in the quality control. But there can be some cases where I don't know if the customer leaves it too long in the packaging, or some things can happen like this. And the customer would be very sensitive to one specific flavor. It tells you, I perceive an off flavor, and when you taste it yourself, no one perceives. That happens to us regularly. So the challenge is to find someone who will be able to spot it. Because if there is an off flavor problem, you need to be able to find a solution. If you cannot perceive it, how can you find a solution? So this is why I insist on the fact that you should never discard flavor information just based on the fact that one or two people perceive this flavor. It can still be very important for some consumers if you want to make the link with consumers, or for some people that will have to taste the product. So that was it for this example. You can still put this information in the map. Don't forget that it's only qualitative. It's not linked to scaling or whatever, but it's just to illustrate the main flavor characteristic of the different products. So this example is more to share with you what you can still do with a limited number of people and still deliver some insights that are more qualitative. The sensory is cannot always be done with the ideal number of people and in the ideal conditions. So and still we can give some guidance based on this type of output. Any questions on this case? I will go to the chat because I think. Yes, I have a question about the logistics. Yes, so there are two questions there actually. One indeed about the logistics. So here the shipments can be a problem. Here it comes from the US, though that's still okay. From US to Europe, usually it's okay for this type of product that are actually long shelf life. So obviously, if you work with fresh bread, you can forget it because the lead time is about 1 week. But here in this type of sample, it was not an issue. These products were from the market. About the bias in the judge, that's a very nice question that I did not talk about. I can give you few remarks here. The question is, could there not be a bias because even the expert judges are from Belgium while the products are from the US? And that's a very, very relevant question. There can be. So that's the answer, but I will give a bit more details. Indeed, we know that our perception and our sensitivity is based on our experience, on our past experience. And if you are living in a specific part of the world, you have a certain food, you are experienced to certain food, some food that come from another part of the world, you might have difficulty to evaluate and especially perceive the subtlety. Donut is not an issue as such because it's also consumed in Europe. So there was no way to say no, that will never work. However, there are some other type of products for which we have already encountered challenges. And this is why it's very important that you don't, if you are working in an international company, that there are several expert panels in different countries and not only people trained in one country, because you will not be able with one panel to cover all the sensory diversity of the world. I will give you two examples that I can think of that are very relevant. One example is actually indeed linked to the US. You have to know that in the US market, the bread is usually very sweet. So all the bread that is packaged is very sweet, especially even the bread which is a wholemeal. And it's much, much sweeter than what we find in Europe, for instance. And we have had difficulties in some projects with our US colleagues telling us that they found some bitterness in the bread baked with wholemeal flour. So at some point it was an issue, so we asked them to send over the flour that they were working with so that we could try to help in covering this bitterness. So you might know that there are flavors, specific flavor that can be used for masking the bitterness. And we wanted to help them find a solution there. So we received the flour and we baked the wholemeal bread. And I was a bit not at ease. I thought, they call it bitterness, but you never know, because those people are not trained. So when people don't like, they say it's bitter, which is a very common mistake. So I asked the panel to validate. And what we said, we didn't ask the panel if the bread was bitter, because if you do that, you induce the answer. So what we said is that we asked the panel to describe the bread freely, how they perceive the flavor and the taste. So we do this exercise and no one mentions the bitter. We also test the bread ourselves and it's not bitter at all. So basically here we have a translation problem because the US people are so used to bread with added sugar in it that when there is no added sugar or when there is stronger flavor in the bread coming from the wholemeal, they tell you it's bitter while it's not. And they will be able to detect much faster than us some specific flavors that can give them the impression that it's bitter, while when we eat, we find it very mild ourselves. So that's a challenge. And in this specific project, we were not able to help them directly. So they had to make taste on their own and try out some solution where we could not help. So they really had to do it on their own side. Another example I have, which can be interesting to illustrate for you, is some specific product from China, which is called the steam buns. So the steam buns is a kind of small bread that is baked by steam. So there is no crust. And in some part of China, they eat a lot of that. This is their staple food, usual staple food that they eat very regularly, daily, and so on. In this type of bread, they applied some sourdough in the product to enhance a bit the flavor profile. But again, they were not trained to do this type of evaluation, so they asked our panel in Belgium to describe the different flavor profile in the steam bun, and the panel did not succeed. And the reason is that it's a new product for us, and we are absolutely not used to this. And for the people, it's too mild. People could not detect anything in the product. While for the Chinese colleague, it was very strong and very flavored. For us, it was not. So it's all a matter of education to the product. And if you are confronted to a product you never eat, it will be much more difficult for you. So cultural difference is indeed a challenge. For the donut, it was not an issue because it's a product that people are confronted to here, even if it's less than in the US. So a big answer. Sorry. Okay. So we are almost reaching the end. I still have one example to share with you, a last one. On bread with grains. So I didn't touch this this type of product yet, but this is a very interesting category to work with, because when you add different types of flours, grains, seeds in the product, it can create a big diversity of flavors. And you can, it's a big challenge in terms of sensory, because you have for different types of bread, you can have, it can be really day and night in terms of flavor profile, but you want to be able to describe it as thoroughly as possible for product development or even for marketing of your product. So here I show you another methodology again that we are using for this type of flavor characterization. So the challenge is the objective is quite different from what I previously shared. Here we are in a perspective of using sensory for marketing purposes. So you develop a new product with specific mix of grain inside, and you want to sustain your product communication with some sensory information. And in this case, you want to be able to describe as precisely as possible the taste and smell, so the flavor profile. It's a bit the same as the sourdough example I explained in the beginning. While for the sourdough, it's for quality control. Here it's more for communication, but the goal is really to go into the detail of this flavor profile. To do this, we developed a methodology based on the rate old apply. So it's a bit different from the check all that apply. Well, it's similar. So here the people have a list of descriptors. So in this case, 22 for flavor, taste and smell of the bread with grains and seeds. And they have to check the flavor that are present. And then they have to indicate the intensity of the flavor on a very short scale. Now, it's an old example. Now we are working on the 3-point scale, so 1, 2, 3. In the past, we started working with 2 levels. And here we have trained our judges on the vocabulary, so they know 22 descriptors, and they're able to relate these descriptors to specific flavor references. I told you just that we made an evolution on our methodologies because we can encounter some problem on developing a scale for flavor, depending on the product category you are working on. it's never easy to develop a scale because you need to, how many points will have the scale? How will I illustrate a very intense flavor, for instance, or a middle flavor? So for some products like chocolate, it's maybe more easy because the product is strong in itself. But for flavors in bread, that can be a bit more challenging. So we decided to train our panel first just to identify. So at the beginning, it was a kata list. They just had to check which flavor were present. And secondly, we asked them, okay, now tell me if the flavor is mild or if it's strong. And now we're at the third stage where they begin to say if it's low, medium, or strong. And working progressively like this makes it more easy for the judge to adapt to using the scale. Here I show you our vocabulary for bread with grains and seeds. You see that you have a quadrant, which is the basic taste that people should not forget. Something is missing here. It's not always so important, so it was not in the initial wheel, but the acidity is should also be there. And then you see all the type of flavors that that are the most common in this type of bread when you add the grains. I told you each of those flavors, we have built up a library of references with reference from flavor houses. So just to smell. We also have illustration of the different flavors with raw material. So for instance, for the vegetable, you can use some hay for people to smell, to illustrate what is dry herbs, for instance. You can use some, for earthy, you can use some quinoa flour or this type of raw material that can really illustrate each flavor. That really helps the judge to learn and to remember and to associate the sensation to something they will find in the bread. Here I show you an example with 4 breads. So this is the type of profile that we end up with. We have a lot of flavor notes. Here they are all on the chart, but you see some of them are not present at all. So we could, anyway, at the end, we will reduce this to the one that are more dominant or less dominant. So, and then from each of the profile, we would then make a description of the flavor profile that would be used by marketing. We do exactly the same for all the origin chocolate, for instance, when you have a very complex flavor profile. The judge can work in the same way with another vocabulary, of course. And something I haven't mentioned, because I explain a lot about training the judges there, is that this type of vocabulary is never exhaustive. So you build it by confronting the people with products, but you will never know if at some point there will not be a new product that comes out and that another flavor will have to be added to your wheel. So you have to see it as a tool that can evolve, that can be completed based on the future type of product that the people will have to taste. And I've reached the end of my presentation. So are there any extra questions on the last example, or in general, on the presentation, or on the sensory industry? I don't see any. Scrolling up to the chat.
Can I just ask one more question here?
Sure.
I'm just wondering, This was a very interesting workshop, actually. I'm wondering, given, for example, the one example that you gave us, which was international, UK, France, and others, and I'm aware that sometimes we can have multiple panels, and we use techniques like multi-factor analysis to make sense of how the different countries describe the products. Is the same technique possible with preference mapping to see how people in different countries like which products, and then using such multi-variable techniques, making sense of such data?
I'm not sure I understand the technique you are referring to.
Okay, what I'm saying is
statistical technique, or
yes. What I've noted that you analyzed, is it the France or the UK data using preference mapping as is on its own, not in conjunction with how other consumers in different countries would like it. So that is what I'm asking to say. Is it possible to analyze at the same time, or you don't have an idea at the moment on that?
So yes, you could indeed compare the different consumers in the same model based on the country they are living in. Right. Yes, I think we can do that. We didn't do, but yeah, I think you could be able to do that. Obviously, yes, I guess so.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I also see a last comment in the chat that I didn't see previously, so I will just take this up very quickly. Someone says, I found it very difficult to rely on QC people to measure smell and flavor intensity. And I agree. And I think that the whole challenge, because that's what I said, if you work with QC and if you have only one or two people, it's not the same as working with the bigger panel. So you have to trust this one or two people to give you an input. However, the problem is that we only have this. So it's either you use those people to have this preliminary input, or you have no check. So, I mean, in this condition, it's either doing it or not. And we prefer doing it, even if we know that it's quite subjective and that the QC person can make mistake. Obviously, we are all humans. But at least it's better than no check at all. So I think that's also a message that sometimes it's either you do the sensory with a few people or you do no sensory. So we prefer to do it, considering, okay, all the attention points are there. And that's why I also said for QC that it's not only these checkpoints, okay? This is the first check, but there are other steps afterwards, especially when the QC person has a doubt. Sometimes it's very clear, you know, so then it's okay. The check is done and there is a big off flavor and there is no doubt about it. So that's out. And sometimes it's very easy to check, to see that, to perceive that it's the right profile. So there is no doubt. But in case there is a doubt, it's not the only step we take. Yeah, I told you that afterwards there is a discussion with R&D, other people are smelling. If there is still a doubt, we can bake the sourdough in the bread, make a triangle test, and so on. So yeah, I wanted to answer to that. I think it's important. Yes, all the examples I use, unfortunately, are in Europe because we haven't had the opportunity to do some sensory in Africa. But the approaches I shared are very diverse, and I think all the tools and the methodology I shared today are definitely suitable to be used in other contexts and in Africa as well, of course. So which concluded the lecture. So if there are no further questions, we can end the lecture now. Thank you very much for your attention, and especially thank you for your very interesting question. It was a pleasure to share with you. I hope it inspired you. That was the purpose. I wish you then a nice follow-up of your training program. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile.